Hi, thanks for watching. These are the Safekeeper socks, and I'm doing a short row toe starting with Judy's Magic cast on. I'm doing 30 pairs of stitches for the extra small size. And I'm not sure what this orange yarn is. It's from a mini that I didn't have labeled in my stash. Using Etain US 0 2mm circular needles. A little bit chewed up. I'm not sure if my puppy got a hold of them or what, but they still work. But they're definitely bent and have tooth marks on them. There's a E-wrap to close the last stitch and hold it in place. So this is the contrast yarn, and it will only be used for this half of the toe and the color loops, and that's it. There's the tail that's a little bit too long. I'm going to knit this whole row. And purl the whole row back after slipping the first stitch. And I think I need to slip this first stitch on this side. Oh, I'm purling. I'm sorry. I sped up the video, so I didn't see whether I was knitting or purling. But so I knit the first row and then turned and slipped the first stitch. Now I'm purling back. There we go. Now I need to slip the first stitch on this knit row and go to almost the end, the stitch before the slip stitch. So there's the first shadow stitch. And you just purl back. Two stitches before the end, and continue in that manner for short rows. Now, after I've completed all my shadow stitches on each side, I want to make color loops right in the center of the toe. So it's ruler time. I was clumsy getting started here. May have had too much coffee, or I think actually my husband was taking the dog out the front door when I was trying to do this. So I was talking to him at the same time. Multitasking. Always dangerous when you're counting at the same time. The nice thing about measuring is that you can always just start over and do it again. So these are some of the longest color loops I've ever worked with. And it's nice that there's only 3 of them. So I think they're still manageable. The trick is to not try to untangle them until you have to, and then just gently pull one at a time and it'll slide through the twisted twist. And you know, with only 3, once you've got 1, then only 2, it loosens up quite easily. And it's still sort of great for carrying around with you and being mobile. As a contrast color, you've got it all there. So even though these were the longest loops I've ever worked with, at least in socks, I thought it worked pretty well, and the design is worth it. The loops might be even longer if you're making a longer leg or a longer foot. So keep that in mind, that it's not something to be afraid of. It's actually liberating. The setup row is always the most yarn management challenge, though. I mean, you can tell that there's enough going on that being interrupted is not ideal, and it's a little tricky, but once you do it a few times, I think it's just logical. So I did, of the 3 color loops, I did 2 on the outside, 1 inch shorter than the center one, because I think that the 2 color twisted stitches do take up slightly more yarn than the straight lines, and you'll see in the pattern the 2 outer color loops have a straight line as one side. So that's why I did do different length color loops. They didn't all end at the same time, but I don't think they need to. Okay, switching to the main color now. That is it for the orange. That is it. So now I'm knitting the shadow stitches together, doing the toe turn. And one thing that I've been doing recently is once I've knit the last shadow stitch, I turn and I don't do anything with the slip stitch at the end. So I turn and then I slip that shadowed stitch. So I'm leaving the last orange stitch on the needle, and now I'm slipping the first main color stitch. And that just decreases the bulk around the side of your foot, the edge of your toe, just a little bit. And I do this on heels now too. Really like it. Okay, now we're getting to these center stitches, and on the purl side, the outer color loops are always just purled two together for this short row portion of the design. I just wanted to climb up the edge of the toe. So on the knit side, they're knit separately over two different stitches, but on the purl side, they're pulled together over one stitch. Now you're going to be tempted to straighten out all your color loops at this point, but you really don't have to as long as your main color is traveling freely. So here I am looking to purl, each strand separately for the center color loop. So I just pick up the whole color loop, but then I only catch one of the threads, one of the strands, and then I save the other strand for the next stitch. I've got it in my hand already. And it actually doesn't really matter which way you wrap it. So now I'm going to purl that last color loop. You see I'm fussing with it. I must have gotten it caught on something. I seem to remember once I got going it was fine, but at the beginning, standing right there at the piano, I was in an awkward position and I wasn't happy about something being somewhere. So now I'm going to purl the shadow stitches going down the other side, and same as the other side, I'm going to stop at the last shadow stitch and turn. There we go. Slipping the first stitch, I just continue. So now comes the reverse part of the toe where you get past the tip, in this case working the color loops as charted. I'm going to I knit that color loop strands together just for a few rows until the toe widens a bit. But the center color loop, I'm going to knit both strands separately. So once they're in my hand, I just pick the strand that I want to knit. You can pick them all up, so I'm not fussing too much. There, I took the second one over. Sorry if my computer fan is getting loud here. stitch. And now I'm making that first shadow stitch. There we go. I love this part of the short row where you turn the toe. It's a little fussy in the beginning. But because color loops hang down from a stitch and don't travel very far from where they're going to be worked, you can always just grab them right there, right close to your needle, and let the rest of the loop just do what it wants to do. And as it shortens, it usually straightens itself out without any untangling on your part. Sometimes when I stop and start, then I do sort of reset myself, but okay. I think I'm just going to leave it here now and do all the shadow stitches. And I think I got a little upset at how I was looking like a mess there, so I decided to weave in those two ends and have it be done right there. You can do that whenever you want, though. You can do it at the end. But it is helpful to get them out of the way, I guess. Okay, that's the first half of the toe complete. Now the second half of the toe is almost done. Let's do one last purl row. So I'm going to knit the last shadow stitch, and then the two slip stitches, turn, and slip that end stitch just one more time. And finish purling in pattern to the end of the row. I'm going to purl that last shadow stitch and purl the last two stitches. Both of those were slipped previously. And now start knitting in the round, starting with one last slip stitch. There we go. Now I should be knitting in the round. Okay, now I've knit the foot up to almost the size of my hand. I'm knitting these socks for my sister who has smaller feet than I do, so I'm using her hand measurement. Tracing isn't that accurate, but it gives an idea, and socks have enough flexibility between negative ease and not negative ease that it works. So I put a stitch marker, 2 stitches on either side of the straight line in the pattern, color loop pattern, to mark the front half and the back half of the sock. Because after I finish the front pattern, the instep, I'm going to make what I call functional color loops using the main color yarn, and they are going to be how I do the gusset increases. And that way I do not have to wonder if I'm on an increase row or a not increase row, and I can also very easily count my increases. And thirdly, the increases are perfectly symmetrical. There's no difference in appearance between left leaning and right leaning. So here we are, ready to make the color loop. And the reason I use the stitch markers is because when I'm knitting around doing the gusset increases, I always make the color loop on the stitch right next to the stitch marker, and I don't have to look and examine my knitting to figure out which stitch that is. So I don't use stitch markers a lot except for the color loops, but I mean marking places in my round, but in this case it is really helpful. So on this side I'm making the color loop the stitch before the stitch marker because the color loop hangs in between two stitches, the one right next to the color stitch marker and the one right next to that on the other side. So that determines where you make your color loop, because the color loop always runs from the stitch you just finished to the stitch you're going to do. So to do that symmetrically, you have to plan ahead and do it, finish the stitch before the one that you're going to call your color loop stitch. So I went off screen here. I'm sorry about that. But I'm just showing how the color loops hang. So on the instep side, there's no color loop, functional color loop hanging, but they're on the other side of the color of the stitch marker. So here I'm getting ready to do the first one. So it's going to be using that color loop on that stitch right next to the stitch marker, both strands together. Not every round, just every other round, because you'll see. Not to get ahead of myself here. Here it is on the other side. Give it a tug and move the stitch marker, and now do the instep pattern. So it'll be very obvious when you have done that row, because you'll see the color loop knit together. Now when you get to it, for the next row, use your main yarn to knit each of those strands individually. So there you're increasing a stitch. And the color loop loosens up a bit, so you need to tighten it up. You can do that, you don't have to do it right away, because when you use it the next round, it'll tighten it up again. Every other round you're going to use that color loop. So here I'm knitting each strand individually on the other side. And it does loosen up, so you need to tug it if you want your knitting to, well, I don't know. I tug a lot. You don't have to until you knit it the next time around, but it does help. Okay, so here I've done, for the size extra small, I've done 12 color loop, functional color loop stitches, and you count them by the ridges on the reverse side of the sock, which are very smooth, so they're comfortable. They're not uncomfortable. I don't need that color loop to mark it anymore, because now, from now on, with that last little bit of color loop, I'm going to use it every round and knit those same 2 stitches over and over again until the end of the color loop. So And that's how I anchor it and finish it off, and I don't need any more increases. So that's just going to be um, finished off by knitting each strand with the end of the color loop. Okay, now I'm getting ready to do the little heel turn. So I'm counting my stitches, and I'm going to the center of the gusset increases, and uh, the sizes vary in their amounts, but for size extra small, there's going to be 4 little center stitches, and then I'm going to do 5 shadow stitches on each side of those 4 center stitches. So short row shadow stitches using my front side only shadow stitches, which I'll link to below. So I'm going to do 5 on each side. And once you have your shadow stitches on the right stitches, you don't need those stitch markers anymore. But it is helpful when you're counting to just have them be there. It's up to you. Just picking up the leg of that. And bringing it back down. Easy as that. Now this version of shadow stitches is tight, so if you're a loose knitter, it may not be what you're used to, but I think the tightness ends up being a good thing because we're going to use these shadow stitches as individual strands to make a whole bunch of increases. So it's not, I don't think, commonly done, and you don't want holes, so it's an advantage to have those shadow stitches be a little bit on the tight side. Okay, still making shadow stitches here. Always on the front side. I think this is maybe the last one. So if you were using functional color loops to make gusset increases for a cuff down sock instead of a toe up sock, your heel turn would be the opposite. You would be decreasing instead of increasing. But here you're going to see I am going to turn every shadow stitch into individual stitches here, knitting each strand individually. And it makes a nice little pocket wedge, curved wedge for your heel, the edge of your heel. And I think it's really easy. There's no make ones, which I just don't like doing. You know, every knitter has a couple things that they just don't like to do. I don't mind short rows. I don't mind purling. I don't mind Kitchener stitch. I don't mind Judy's Magic Cast On, but I just don't like make ones. So you can get away with it. Okay, so here we're at the functional color loop, and I'm going to use the color loop end. This is the last time going around for a little while, because we're going to start doing the heel flap short rows in just a minute. So those color loops are going to end after we finish the heel flap. Okay, we're on the other side now. Still using the end of that functional color loop to anchor those 2 stitches. This one's a little bit longer. Doesn't matter. It hardly shows. Okay. Now coming around this side, we're going to knit these gusset stitches until we get to the shadow stitches, and then do the same thing we did on the other side and knit them individually. Now I know this side the shadow stitches are tight, so I'm having to work the yarn, work the needle into the yarn to get those stitches. Yeah, and it gets tighter and tighter as I go because I'm pulling on that yarn. But those 5 stitches turn into 10 stitches right there. But so easy. I'm going to use this technique a lot, I think. Cuff down and toe up. I guess cuff down would be more like a Flegel heel. I'm don't know for sure what the name of that heel is, but anywhere where you're making gusset increases, these functional color loops should work. And you don't have to worry about measuring the color loops as long as you know you can get the minimum the maximum number of stitches you need. You don't have to shorten them considerably because you can always anchor them like we're doing here. Okay, now we're ready to do the flap. So that last stitch of those center stitches will be knit 2 together. Okay, there they are. A little bit tight. Okay, turn, and this is all as usual. You just slip the first stitch, purl back, purl 2 together, turn, slip 1, and continue in this manner until you've done all of your heel flap decreases. So this is a really good place to decide how big you want your leg to be, how loose you want it to be. Instead of reducing down to 60 stitches for an extra small leg, because this is quite a narrow foot, I didn't want the sock to be too hard to put on, I kept it at 64 stitches instead. I didn't decrease all the way. Okay, so the last decrease you do on this side, you then continue knitting. And you still have one more decrease to do on the other side, and you're going to do that by doing an SSK. And that closes the gap. So here, I think we're ending the functional color loop. Anyone have a better name for that? Let me know, but I sort of like functional color loop. It sounds so useful. Don't need that anymore. That stitch marker can come out, and from now on those stitches will be just knit with the main color yarn. Okay, still working on the instep pattern here. Let's do a quick check on foot length. It's pretty perfect. And I guess I don't show the other side, but that last decrease on the other side, you want to do an SSK for that last stitch, and it works really well. And then you've got your clean, elegant gusset. You could do a slip stitch heel flap if you like. These color loops on the edge of it, by the cuff, I can just take them out. Sometimes I just am busy and knitting in the car or something, so I don't take them out. Instead, I just continue the cuff. Also in this pattern, that ribbing on the back of the leg, completely optional. I just chose to do it because I didn't want baggy ankles for my sister's sock. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.